Between 2011 and 2015, my old friend Jay and I used to do a lot of hiking and camping. We lived out in Missouri, so we'd mostly head out to our local spots for just a few beers and some campfire food after our day's hike. Now, we had a very casual approach to this back in 2011, but by 2015, just one day's worth of relaxing hiking just wasn't enough for us anymore. And that's how we got started camping together. We spent a night in Three Creeks Conservation Area, and then a few months later, we hit up Pinnacles Youth Park, which was cool because it's only permitted for day use, so technically, we were outlaws for a night. Now, after that, we visited Eagle Bluffs and then spent a whole series of weekends in Mark Twain until it felt like a giant backyard to us. And then, after a total of almost 20 hiking and camping trips together, we decided to drive all the way down into Arkansas to visit the Ozark National Forest. Now, I feel like I should make it clear that almost the whole of Missouri and northern Arkansas is technically the Ozarks, but there's a major difference between the northern and central regions, which are mostly flat plains where me and Jay grew up, and the more mountainous areas to the further south. These are all in either Arkansas or Oklahoma, and while you'd be right in saying that they're both part of the Ozarks, the terrain could not be more different in places. The part it's probably most famous for, where all the fancy resorts and casinos are, is the Lake of the Ozarks. It's like peak civilization around Branson and the lakes, and if you keep driving south, it's all still flat, cozy-looking farmland for about 20 miles more. But then you start hitting the hills and the forests, and what once looked like settled land started looking a lot more untamed. The Ozark Mountains are a maze of lowland passageways, hemmed into these hills that are sometimes almost 1,000 feet tall. There's a lot of creeks and streams flowing off from the White River too, so for wild campers like me and Jay, the place was as close to paradise as we were ever likely to find. We ended up driving down to a little town called Limestone, where we made a donation to the church so we could park in their lot for a couple of days. And then the plan was as follows. Walk a nice, leisurely 16-mile route over the course of 3 nights. The first night, we camped at a place called Car Wash Falls, the second at Big Piney Creek, and then the third back at Car Wash before heading back to our car and back to civilization. And we were psyched for it. We had it all planned out. And wild camping is like a drug in a way. If your goal is to keep doing wilder and more challenging stuff, you need bigger and badder trips each time to get truly excited about it, and the mountains down south made for our biggest and baddest trip yet. We were prepared too. We had a lot of experience already, and we'd learned from our mistakes, so we had everything from bear mace to aqua tabs to a 357 with us, not to mention 2 fully stocked first aid kits, one in each of our packs, just in case anything happened to the other. But no matter how much you prepare, there are some things that you can't prepare for. But on this trip, we had to learn that lesson all over again in the worst possible way. The first day was just about as perfect as you can imagine, and then thanks to the route that we'd picked out, we would spend way more time walking and way less time trying to figure out where we were. Car Wash Falls made for a beautiful place to camp as we had all the fresh water we could drink. But then after a fine campfire dinner and a restful night's sleep, I woke up to find that Jay wasn't in his shelter. I didn't panic or anything, I just looked around to see where he was. And then sure enough, I saw him over by the tree line, looking up into the wooded slope that lay between us and the waterfall. I gave him a loud whistle, which only had him turning his head for a second before he started up again into the hills. And that's when I called out to him, to ask what had taken his interest so much. Now I figured that he'd probably just yell his answer back to me, but when he didn't, and stayed quiet as he turned and started walking back towards me, I figured there had been some kind of wildlife encounter. We mostly stayed quiet around animals so we didn't spook them. Now from the way he kept looking over his shoulder as he returned to where we were camped, I figured that he might have seen a black bear, but Jay shook his head. He said a person had been watching us from the tree line and that he only noticed as he started walking towards the falls to take a morning wash. He added that he didn't get spooked until after he waved at what appeared to be a younger man, but instead of waving back, the guy turned and began jogging up the slope away from him. Now Jay obviously wasn't thrilled by this, but he didn't think the guy was anything more than curious. He probably figured out that Jay, who was wearing only shorts and carrying a towel, wanted to just get a bath in the waterfalls, and then jogged away because he wanted to give him some privacy. But then Jay said when he got to the falls, he looked up the track to see that same person watching him from about 60 to 70 yards off. He stayed watching as Jay rinsed himself off in the cold water, and Jay said that he wanted to shout something like, "Take a photo, a-hole, it'll last longer," but decided it best to just not antagonize any fellow hikers or, God forbid, any locals. Thankfully, the guy watching was no longer visible when Jay stopped taking a bath, but then as he was walking back through the trees towards this open grassy area where we were camped, he got this creeping feeling that he was being watched. He then stopped, turned around, and bingo. This strange dude was up at the tree line near the track, watching him walk off. That's why Jay was stopped and watching the tree line when I first woke up and saw him, and why he seemed so cautious when he walked back over to me and started dressing again. This wasn't the first time that we'd come across someone acting weird in the woods during one of our camping trips, and the way you handle it is to just move on, and not emotionally, of course, but physically. People accused us of hunting out of season or of being on their land, or sometimes they got confrontational for what seemed like just the hell of it. But every single time, the proven solution was to hike a couple of miles in any direction. No one ever followed us or messed with us. It was just sort of a out of sight, out of mind for those a-holes. So that's what we did. We packed up our campsite, hiked about 2 miles further south, and then stopped in some shade to eat a little bit of breakfast before getting back to it. And the rest of the second day was eventful, and we made it to Big Piney Creek by around dinner time. A whole creek meant taking a full dip after the second day's hike, which was nothing short of incredible. We'd also walked a full 7 miles from our last campsite, and each of us thought that we'd hiked our way out of any potential trouble. But we were wrong. We were sitting around the campfire that night, passing a bottle of whiskey back and forth, when suddenly we heard a noise in the tree line about 50 yards behind us. We had our bags of food hung up in that same tree line, so at first we figured it might have been a deer sniffing at them, or if we were really unlucky, a bear. Black bears aren't all that dangerous or confrontational, but they can still put in a fine effort at knocking your food bag off of whatever branch it's hanging from. And if they do that when you bring as little food as we did, you're kind of in trouble. And so, once we were sure something was sniffing around our food bags, we got up and ran towards the tree line with our flashlights, waving them around and making noise to scare off whatever was there. We each heard something running, but we never got a glimpse of what it was. We then walked back to our campfire and tried to settle in again, but maybe 15 minutes later, we heard something moving towards us through the dark and distant trees. It didn't go near the food bags again. It just crept up and down in a different part of the tree line, staying quiet for long periods like it was almost watching us. We honestly thought it was a deer or something, and just a curious one at that, and we'd been on so many trips by that point that some distant, non-aggressive animal didn't spook us in the slightest, especially not with the bear mace and that gun close at hand. The trouble was, the thing stayed there for what felt like hours. Even after we'd doused the campfire and were lying in our shelters on our mats in pitch darkness, you'd hear the old crunch or crack of something creeping through the distant tree line. Jay would occasionally say something like, "You hear that? There it is again." But each time we just sort of laugh off the tension like we always did. Now, I didn't much care what it was as long as it stayed where it was. And then after a while, and after we heard whatever it was slowly retreating back into the woods, I was finally able to relax enough to get some sleep. The next morning was kind of tense, as the first thing in our minds was the thing in the tree line the previous night. But once again, we were planning on packing up and moving on after a quick bath in the creek. Now, we felt more than capable of defending ourselves against whatever or whoever it was, and we didn't once suspect that some single entity had been stalking us along the trails that whole time. But that, ladies and gentlemen, is what I now suspect we were wrong about. The plan was to spend a second night near Car Wash Falls, just in a less visible spot where we were less likely to attract unwanted attention. But then in the early afternoon, we stopped in the shade of some trees at the edge of the trail when Jay announced that he was going to take a dump. He grabbed some wipes and the little poop shovel we always brought with us and then walked up off this low rise that flattened out at the top, just enough so I lost sight of him after maybe 20 or 30 yards or so. I figured that I was in for a quiet, uneventful couple of minutes, but literally no sooner did I think that I heard Jay up on the rise yell, and these were his exact words. "Whoa! Hey there, little buddy. You just about scared the crap out of me there." I couldn't tell if he was talking to an animal or a person, but I obviously wanted to find out. So I went running up that rise and through the trees atop it until there, right before me, I saw Jay facing down a little kid. Now, he couldn't have been any older than about 11 or 12, and aside from his brown hair, I guess the best way to describe him in one word is neglected. He was wearing what looked like hand-me-downs, and in his hand, he held what looked like a toy bow, with a little quiver full of toy arrows on his back. Now, I guess I only thought that because of how small they were. They had this handmade look to them, which I guess should have been the big clue right there. But I couldn't fathom that this kid had a legitimate bow and arrow and was just allowed to head out playing with them on his own. It was only when I got closer that the kid took one of the arrows from his quiver, and while I didn't see any big shiny points on the arrow, I didn't see like a safety stopper or whatever either. I remember looking at Jay and asking him, "Dude, is that thing real?" Only for him to immediately turn the question on the kid. The kid didn't say anything back, he just shot me a look so I could see all of his face for a second, enough to see that he was ugly, really ugly, and had a lazy right eye. He then looked back at Jay, put the arrow on the string, and then pulled it back. And that sound it made, that tight, almost creaky sort of tension in the string, that's what confirmed to us that it wasn't some toy. This thing was real. We just ran, or tried to anyway, because the next thing Jay lets out is this loud scream. Not loud like scared, but like a scream of pain, and I knew in that moment he'd been hit. Now, I was nearest to that slope that led to our pack, so I was the first down and the first to look back, but not until I heard a second scream of pain from Jay, and when I got to my pack and looked up, he had two, not one, but two small wooden arrows sticking out of him, one out of his shoulder and the other much lower near his hip. He screamed at me to grab the gun, but I was already going for it. And then since I kept it within easy reach, it was maybe only a second or two before I had it pointed at the kid, who by then had chased us to the top of that rise that I mentioned. He let one more arrow fly at us, but I guess the sight of the gun threw his aim off a little, because right before I fired, I heard the whooshing around of it flying past my head before the kid took off in the opposite direction. I knew I must have missed him too, because there was no way in hell a kid would still be standing there after taking a .357 at any range. And then as he ran off, I didn't even think to pull the trigger again. But that enraged Jay. I totally understand where he's coming from. The kid was a threat to us, but shoot a child in the back while he's running away, I don't know. I couldn't. Now, if it was me who had taken two arrows, then yeah, maybe I had no problem taking a second shot, but it just didn't occur to me that he might keep on following us and that we weren't quite out of danger yet. The kid didn't follow us, not to my knowledge, but all Jay kept saying as I went for my phone was, "What if he comes back?" Now, I was right in suspecting that I wouldn't have any bars, so we had to walk all the way to the opposite side of the valley and away from the kid to get some elevation. Jay was obviously in a lot of pain, but if he'd stayed put with a gun, he didn't want to risk missing his shot if the kid came back or getting shot by an arrow from some stealth position, and so we went together. Jay was wincing in pain with every step, and I kept my head on a swivel with my gun tight in my grip just in case the kid showed up behind us. It sounds so crazy even writing this all out, that a kid had us fearing for our lives, but if you saw arrows sticking out of your friend and saw the look in that kid's eyes before he drew back his bow, you wouldn't be laughing about it either. He was not playing around. He wanted to do us harm, and even if he did have his whole life ahead of him, I wasn't about to let him hurt me or my friend any further. We made it high enough to get a signal, enough to place a 911 call with the Ozarks stretched out below us like some great green sea. And I felt this huge wave of relief when the call connected, and then after explaining what had happened, I began the process of relaying our GPS coordinates to the dispatcher along with a general description of our surroundings. We were told that help was on the way, so we were to stay put, stay on the line, and to not try and remove those arrows as they would only make Jay's bleeding even worse. The dispatcher then transferred me over to the local sheriff's department, and one of the deputies asked if the person who shot Jay was still around. I told him no, that he ran off when I shot at him and we didn't see him since. That's why he told us the department was mobilizing a search and rescue team and how the ground team would be with us within a maximum of 40 minutes if the terrain permitted. But if it didn't permit, it was a case of bringing in a helicopter to get us out. And after maybe 15 minutes, the adrenaline was starting to wear off for the both of us, so Jay seemed to be in more and more pain with each passing second. We were waiting for another call from either an Arkansas or Missouri Air Care helicopter service, which would have taken too long for ground teams to get to us, and we were frightened that the call wouldn't come. But thank God, the system worked just as it should, and within a few minutes or more, my phone was buzzing with incoming calls from a flight nurse. Now, he talked us through walking downhill and back towards the clearing that we'd been walking through so they could use it as a makeshift landing zone, and after that, he told us to stay put and stay visible, and then said that they'd be with us as soon as possible. Now, the wait was agonizing, but Jay said the pain was easier to bear knowing that help was on the way. Now, his shirt and pants were soaked with blood by then, and he was laying down on his front trying not to move. Moving around so much had made the wounds worse, I think, but like he said, it was all easier knowing that help was on the way. And then within 10 to 15 minutes tops, we heard the distant sound of rotor blades as the rescue chopper closed in. And there was still plenty of light, so the crew had no trouble seeing us, thankfully, and then after circling once, they stopped above us and flew closer to the ground. The crew then dropped a specialized stretcher that they used to haul people up. One of the medics came with it on a rope, and before we got Jay on the stretcher, he had to clean and dress the wounds and clip the arrows so he could lie on his back without too much pain. Jay asked why he didn't pull them out together if he had his whole medical kit with him, but the guy yelled something about ER doctors doing it in a sterile environment and how that was a way better option. I figured that's where me and Jay would part ways, and I'd have to walk all the way back on my own before driving to whatever hospital he was being taken to. But it turns out the chopper had room for me, so I got to experience my one and only helicopter ride with a wounded Jay laying at my feet. I remember looking out the window as we took off, thinking maybe I'd see that kid in the tree line, but there was no one. Whoever that kid was, he was long gone. And after we flew out, and after sitting in the hospital waiting area for a couple of hours, one of the doctors appeared with some good news for me. Jay's surgery had been successful, and the arrows had luckily missed anything vital, but they needed to keep him overnight for observation just to make sure neither wound was infected. I then had to wait a bit longer for a deputy from the county to show up, and then we did a whole interview on the 90-minute drive back, the place that we'd departed from a few days before. And that's where the sheriff and some park rangers had set up a small temporary HQ as they had guys searching the trails for any kind of evidence. But even though they'd been searching for a couple of hours already, nothing noteworthy had been found. I was exhausted by that point, but after collecting both of our packs from one of the rangers, I had to get into my car and drive all the way back to wait for Jay to be discharged. I found a cheap motel, paid for the night, and then slept like the dead after taking a shower, at least until the nightmares woke me up. I guess with Jay being in some strange place and knowing that he was still in the hospital, my mind couldn't rest properly, so I kept waking up every couple of hours to check the time until I eventually got a call from the hospital saying that Jay was good to go. Seeing him again made for one hell of a reunion, but that's where the good vibes started to end because after that, we had to talk with the sheriff's deputy, and I don't think I'll ever forget what he had to say to us. Long story short, he told us not to get our hopes up. He said that folks who lived up in those hills weren't nearly as nice or welcoming as the folks in town, and that most likely they'd close ranks to protect whichever kid shot Jay with those arrows. He said he and his buddies up in the county sheriff's department had been dealing with the mountain folk like that for as long as anyone could really remember, that they lived separately by their own laws, and how, in his humble opinion, the best thing I could have done was shoot that kid dead while I had the chance. That way, I'd have done the whole community a real big favor and saved somebody a whole lot of trouble in the future. Hey Joel, big fan, and I think this one might interest you. I grew up in a little place called Kyle in North Carolina. We had a church, a pond, and a small community library, and that was it. We didn't have much to do growing up, but what we did have was the Nantahala National Forest right there on our doorstep. And so, as you can imagine, me and my friends spent a heck of a lot of time playing in the woods growing up. And that's how we got to know Cornbread. Cornbread wasn't this guy's name. We never learned it because every time we asked, he'd just give us a different one each time. And so one day, after we'd heard him walking through the woods and yelling about it, we just took to calling him Cornbread, and it stuck. We didn't think much about his past. We just knew that he was what you might call a hermit, and that while he bothered hikers or townfolks from time to time, he was ultimately harmless. But while Cornbread was harmless, and while he definitely had a wholesome side to him, he had a creepy one too, and this led to all kinds of crazy rumors flying around about him, some of which I can confirm and some that I can't, but I can definitely believe. Now, for example, and on the more wholesome scale of things, Cornbread used to like eating his meals with local wildlife. You'd hear about him roasting birds or rabbits over there in the forest, but I only ever saw him eating from cans. And when I did, I saw him scoop a little of whatever was out of his can, and then he backed off and waited until a bird flew down and started pecking at it. Now, he didn't start eating until the bird flew down, and he sat there chomping with his big old smile on his face and laughing to himself all softly every so often. At the time, I thought it was the coolest thing I'd ever seen. Like, Cornbread was more in tune with nature than the rest of us, and I guess that was true in a lot of ways. I was just too young to realize the downsides of living that kind of life. I remember one time we saw Cornbread as we were walking through the woods, and we said, "Hey there, mister. How's it going?" Cornbread looks around and sees us, then waves back, saying, "Hey, kids." But then he had us in stitches by turning to all the trees around him, too, saying, "Hello, tree. Hello, tree. Hello, tree." He acted kind of silly like that sometimes, but he wasn't just acting up to keep us entertained either. Some of my mom's friends said that he'd been famous for having long conversations with trees for quite a while, and that sometimes he'd sing them lullabies at night. And while that sounds kind of wholesome, people said it scared the ever-living crap out of them when they heard it floating through the darkness on the trails at night. Now, he also liked to refer to himself as we, and while as kids we just thought that was funny, the grown-up me looks back on that thinking, damn, he really was crazy, huh? Now, other examples of Cornbread's weird behavior was how sometimes, if you were walking through the woods, you'd see the little homes Cornbread had built for animals. Now, they were teepee-shaped homes made of sticks of varying sizes, and were bound by whatever cord he had around at the time. Now, he'd keep them occupied too, even if it was just insects in there feeding on whatever food he'd left for them, and then he'd go around checking in on them like some kind of critter landlord. And again, that sounds pretty wholesome on paper, right? But when you're walking through the woods and you come across a small village worth of little teepee huts, all jagged like some creepy little elves made them, you start worrying about the state of mind of the person who made them and if they're close by or not. Now, I never saw this personally, but I heard Cornbread liked to keep things that he found in big glass mason jars that he kept somewhere in the woods, but specifically things left behind by people. Now, I'm not talking about trash or cigarette butts, nothing like that. I'm talking about lost hairbands, gloves, even buttons that had fallen off of old or poorly made clothes. Anything that was lost, he liked finding a home for it, and that home was in his mason jar, stashed somewhere in the woods. Now, I heard someone spotted him while out hunting one day and that Cornbread was cradling that big glass jar of his like a baby and whispering to it. Now again, I never saw that with my own eyes, but I believe it. Sometimes, and this is something I did see with my own eyes, you'd find these flimsy chair-looking constructions made of sticks and twigs. They weren't strong enough to sit on, as a buddy of mine discovered to our amusement, but they weren't meant for people. Cornbread used to build them for ghosts, and people said he'd sit in front of them at night, waiting for one to come along and tell him its story. Now, I was never out in the woods that late, so that's not something I can confirm, but if you told me he liked talking to ghosts the way he liked talking to the trees and the animals, I'd believe it 100%. He used to write these letters too, but then instead of mailing them, he'd fix them to tree trunks, impaling them to shoots or branches that he'd cut away to form a little tack. Now, me and my friends found one once, and we took it down to see that Cornbread had addressed the letter to tomorrow, like he was writing to the future trying to get messages from it. I obviously don't believe it worked for him, but it does mean I believe the rumors that Cornbread used to tell random hikers about things that hadn't happened yet. I heard the rumor started when Cornbread apparently told a local woman, whose mother happened to be sick with cancer, "Your mama's going to be just fine." It turns out the mom was going through her last round of chemo at the cancer center over in Franklin, and a couple of weeks later, she got the good news from the doctors. Her cancer was gone, and it wasn't coming back anytime soon. I also heard a rumor that he told another hiker something to the effect of, "Your time is short." And then that same hiker later went missing while walking in some of the other areas of the country. But I think that might lean on the less believable sides of things, no matter how well it ties in with these things. And I also didn't ever see the darker, stranger side of Cornbread because I wasn't a hiker from someplace else. He loved messing with hikers, but never locals, always outsiders. But I guess that's half the reason he attained the status of a creepy, not-so-urban legend from some of the college kids who came around hiking. He used to follow them around, listening to them talk with each other, then he'd mimic their voices to trick them into doing stuff. Cornbread was a really good mimic, too. Like one time he mimicked my buddy's mom so well that we actually thought that she came looking for us. But nope, it was Cornbread, which is why I totally believe he could creep out a group of college kids like that by mimicking one of their voices. He'd also give them false directions if any of them were foolish enough to ask, and I heard more than one group of student hikers had gotten lost as hell after taking him at his word. I heard this from more than one source too, and how sometimes they'd show up in town afterwards complaining about some weirdo out in the woods who played a mean trick on them. Or sometimes, and this is something he did to solo hikers more often than not, just so they'd even be more creeped out, he'd carve little figures of them and then leave them on their cars. Cornbread would take a stick, no thicker than your finger really, and he'd carve it so good that you'd be able to tell that it was supposed to be based on their hair and clothes. Only instead of carving little dots or circles for eyes, Cornbread would only ever carve little X's instead. A little detail which I have no doubt would have creeped me out too, had I been one of those to find it. Now, he also had a habit of staring at a spot just over their shoulders and smiling faintly as if someone was walking up right behind them. I thought this was kind of funny when I first heard it, just playing little tricks on people like he did, but I guess all combined, he was a real creep towards any hikers he didn't recognize. He only got creepier as we got older too, as not only did we start hearing weirder and darker stories about Cornbread, but he lost the softness and gentleness he reserved only for children. Sometimes he'd creep grown-ups out by trying to very earnestly explain that the woods used to have more doors. He wouldn't just explain this either. He'd start getting all frustrated and angry that he couldn't find them anymore, and obviously people didn't enjoy seeing a weird old hermit freaking out about imaginary things while they were out hiking. Now, he also claimed that there are lines in the woods that it was dangerous to cross, and that people who went missing out in the middle of nowhere had often crossed these lines without knowing it. This meant he often made crazy long detours to make it from A to B because it was better to do all that walking than face whatever fate had been suffered by those who crossed them. And then there's the stuff I can 100% confirm because he did it around or in front of me. And the first being that sometimes he'd stand in the same spot in the woods, completely still, for what must have been hours. He'd stand there not moving, not even looking like he was breathing, and it didn't matter if you walked up and shouted cornbread, he just couldn't move. And then one time, I was out playing with my friends when we ran into him. He told us, and completely out of the blue I should say, that he hadn't slept in years because, and I'm using his exact words here, "It's safer if one of us stays awake." And as far as I know, cornbread was still around when I went off to college, but it was also around then that sightings of him started to drop off. Folks who saw him, the ones who knew him, said he was slowing down, getting old, maybe even getting sick. Then there came a time when we realized no one had seen him in months, which quickly turned into years. And now, we all tend to believe that cornbread has passed and that he's out there in the woods someplace, slowly becoming a part of the place he chose to call home. A few years back, me and a few old college friends of mine had a little reunion. We met at UCLA back in the 90s, and we used to spend a lot of our spare time hiking up in Santa Monica and sometimes in the Angeles National Forest. Now, it's that second one that we chose for our reunion. Then, after dinner and drinks at what amounted to a little slumber party at my place, we drove out to Angeles in the early morning to begin our day's hike. And the hiking was fantastic, and it was awesome to be hanging out with old friends again, but after we got back to the place that I parked my car, we found that the car was missing. I had a total "dude, where's my car" moment because I did not want to believe my car had actually been stolen. And then slowly but surely, I accepted it, and I got appropriately pissed off. I called the cops from the trailhead to report my car and then called a cab to take us to this Korean barbecue place. Now, the whole plan was to get drunk and eat barbecue until we passed out anyway, but since I was so mad and upset about my car, I was ready for death by short ribs and margaritas at that point. Now, after maybe an hour of ordering small plates and cocktails, I progressed from this is terrible stage of car theft grief to this isn't so bad sort of stage. I decided that I hated that stupid car anyway and that I deserved a better one, and that a-hole car thief had done me an actual favor. It was all total bluster, of course, proven by the fact that when an LA County Sheriff's deputy called and told me my car had been found, I'd have been jumping for joy if I wasn't seated around a table with a bunch of empty glasses in front of me. It seemed like a miracle. Not even 3 full hours after my initial report, and my stolen car had been found. But it was no miracle. It felt way more like a curse, and you'll see what I mean by that in a minute or two here. According to the deputy, my car had been found abandoned, having been driven down a trail and off-road by whoever had stolen it. I asked if they had any idea who that person might have been, and that's when the deputy asked me the rather chilling question of, "Do you know of anyone who might wish to do you harm?" Now, the obvious answer was no. But then he followed up by asking if I'd argued with anyone recently, if I'd made anybody angry in the recent past. Now again, I couldn't think of anyone who might steal my car because that's obviously what he was implying, right? But it wasn't just that they'd stolen my car, it's the condition they left it in. So one of the things that I brought with me in the car for the drive out to the forest was an old photo album. It included dozens of photos that we'd taken during our time in college, many of which had been taken during our many hikes together. One of them, a photo which included only myself and none of my other friends, had been removed from the photo album and stabbed into my dashboard with a knife. A knife that most definitely belonged to the person who stole my car. I literally couldn't believe what I was hearing for a second or two, like the poor guy had to straight up repeat himself a whole second time for it to actually sink into my head. And that's why he kept asking if I'd pissed anybody off, because he couldn't think of any other reason why I'd been especially targeted like that. Now, I mean, it obviously could have been a coincidence, and whichever lunatic stole my car just so happened to pick a photo of me when he just so happened to have stolen my car, too. But no matter how much my friends tried to reassure me of how that had to have been the case, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was personal somehow. My insurance dealt with all the repairs, and I ended up getting my car back a few weeks later, almost as good as new. But just being inside it and just looking at it, the memories creeped me out so much that I ended up selling it not long after at a steep discount, just so I could be rid of it. Because God forbid whoever stole it somehow worked out where I lived based on spotting it outside my apartment building. Because if there was a next time, it might not just be a photo of me that got a knife stuck into it. After I graduated college, I ended up moving to Jacksonville for work. I didn't know anybody when I first moved, not until I signed up to an all-female yoga class and met two like-minded women. Now, for context, I too was a female in her mid-20s, and the three of us had a lot in common. We were health nuts, independently minded, and we each had a deep love of the natural world. So I guess it was only a matter of time before one of us suggested that we all go hiking. It became my primary form of exercise, and it was great hanging out with them, but for me, it went a little beyond that. I guess it was a combination of burning off steam and the gratitude that you feel for everyday luxuries after walking somewhere wild and kind of scary. But hiking became a big chunk of my hierarchy of needs, as it were. And then one day, after both my friends just so happened to cancel at short notice, I thought, screw it, I'm going solo. Now, my usual haunts would vary, but on this occasion, I decided to do a little exploring in the Osceola National Forest. Osceola has a lot of swamp and a lot of wildlife, but thankfully, enough solid ground to make for a solid hike. I'd never visited previously, but it was only being about an hour's drive away, and I figured that it was a fine choice for a day's hike. Now, it's honestly one of the most beautiful places I'd ever been to, but in all the years since my visit that day, I haven't been able to bring myself to go back. And if I had one piece of advice for those that visit, it's stay on the trails. It was about 1 p.m. when I was walking along a wide stretch of sandy trail with patches of spaced out pines on either side of me. Now, these specific pines are really tall and skinny with only a few bunches of leaves towards the top, so the whole place had this eerily beautiful feeling that I enjoyed so much about places like that. How nature is sometimes beautiful and terrifying all at once. Now, I was a pretty experienced hiker by that point, so I like to step off the trail sometimes and walk just a little bit into the wilderness to get a sense of how wild and free things once were, before people were around to change that. Now, I didn't push my luck. I'd like to think that I had an appropriate amount of reverence and respect for the natural world, but sometimes it's not a matter of caution, it's a matter of luck. And on that day, my luck ran out. After stepping off the trail, I was treading on pine needles and very soft earth. Not so soft that it felt waterlogged or muddy, there was just a very nice give to it. It didn't feel unstable, it wasn't suspiciously uneven in places, it just looked nice and peaceful and relatively safe. But then, and out of nowhere, it felt like the ground opened up to swallow me. I screamed as I fell, and at first I remember that rush of air past my ears, and then I quickly came to a thudding stop as the sinkhole squeezed off towards the bottom, and gravity forced my legs into it. Feeling my legs get all scraped up was agony. With all the fear that I was feeling, it was like the pain barely even registered. All I was feeling was this horrible panic as my world was being plunged into near darkness and suddenly not being able to move. Now, it was easily the most frightening experience of my whole life, and I could barely see because I had all this dirt in my eyes that turned to mud as I tried to wipe it away. But through all of that, I had this one bright burning hope inside of me, and all because I had this teeny tiny transponder on my backpack called a Garmin InReach. Now, it's hooked up to a satellite network which tracks your position, and while I couldn't immediately activate the SOS function with it being in my backpack, which I couldn't access, I could still trust it to relay my position to my mom, my roommate, and my 2 friends, all of whom could access the data by plugging in my user ID and just a simple password into a website. All I had to do was wait until someone noticed I either wasn't moving or hadn't returned home, and they'd have search and rescue people looking for me in no time. But therein lay the hard part, the waiting. My hope never completely faded because I trusted the inReach to actually do its job, but there were moments when this terrible sense of doubt, dread, and panic got almost too much to bear. Part of me hoped my mom would notice my lack of progress almost right away, and after calling my phone and getting no answer, she'd immediately call the cops. My phone was on vibrate, and it was right there in my pocket too, but the way that I was wedged meant that I couldn't get my hand into or near my pocket to slide it out. I didn't know if it had bars or even if the inReach still worked at depths like that. I didn't even know how deep I really was, just that I could see this little blip of light above me from where I'd fallen through, and the hole had curved off a little towards the bottom. I just had to hope everything was working as it should and that eventually someone would come rescue me. But telling myself to be hopeful and patient and actually doing it were two things entirely. I didn't think that I could get any more scared or uncomfortable, but then the night rolled in, and it started to rain. It was only some light rain, but being trapped in complete darkness and imagining the hole slowly filling up with water as I was still trapped, it caused this whole new wave of panic in me. The bugs were way more active at night too, especially as it started to get wet, and I had nightmares about them crawling all over me and through my hair for weeks afterwards. I remember screaming, not just in the hope of being heard by someone, but because the frustration and disgust that bugs were all over me and there was nothing I could do about it. But the whole time, the thought of the inReach doing its job kept me from completely losing my mind with fear. The one consolation about it going dark was that if someone had actually bothered to check up on me, it wouldn't be long before they called my cell or called 911. And I remember having that thought right there in my mind when the first buzzing sounded from behind me. Someone was realizing that something was wrong, which marked the beginning of the end of my ordeal. And while I couldn't answer the call to tell them something was wrong, I knew that not answering it would be just as effective in getting the message across. The call stopped, then maybe a second or two later, another one started up again. Maybe 2 or 3 more followed, shorter ones that time, and then silence. And even though I was trapped down there in the dark, I felt this sense of hope rising up inside of me. Now, I'm not sure how much longer I waited, but fixating on my eventual rescue kept me sane as the darkest hours ticked by. My phone started ringing again and again, and even though I couldn't answer the calls, the sound brought me so much hope that I started to cry at one point. Crying helped me feel just a little bit calmer, and while I was never close to anything like being able to shut my eyes and sleep, those final hours had a strange sense of calm to them as I counted every single second until I was rescued. The panic only started up again when I heard voices from above me as this irrational voice in my head started asking what would happen if they couldn't get me out. I kept thinking about that guy the 127 Hours movie was based on, Aaron Ralston, and how he lost an arm because of how he got stuck. But those search and rescue guys were professionals who figured out how to get me out unharmed almost immediately. And I was yelling myself hoarse by the time I saw their flashlights at the top of the hole, and then after calling down that everything was going to be fine, prompting yet more tears from myself, they got to work lowering someone down to me. She had a medical bag with her and kept on talking with me really calm as she gave me water to drink from through a tube. Next came the guy whose job was to plan the actual extraction, and after assuring me the walls were stable enough for a quick extraction, meaning no heavy digging, he told me that I'd be home and safe in no time at all. And after that, 2 more guys came down and they worked together to gently sift the dirt around my hips with these little collapsible tools that they had with them. Now, once I was loose, they slid me into this bright orange rescue litter, basically a tough stretcher with straps and a harness, before clipping me in tight. They radioed up to the team up top, and a winch started to pull us all up slowly and steadily. And then finally, after what seemed like way longer, I emerged from the sinkhole. And even though it was dark and rainy and I was kind of cold by then, it felt like one of the best moments of my entire life. They had an ambulance waiting for me right there on the trail, and I also heard that they had a helicopter on standby just in case they'd pulled me up to find more serious injuries. But since I didn't have any, the paramedics checked me over quickly and wrapped my ankle to cushion it where I'd sprained it pretty heavily, and then off we went to the hospital to confirm that I was good to head home again. Now, from the moment I fell down that sinkhole to the moment that I got home, I think no more than around 13 to 14 hours had actually elapsed. But limping back through the front door of my apartment felt so relieving it was surreal, like I'd been gone way longer. I still can't believe how fast and smooth those search and rescue people got me out, and I'll never stop being thankful for how professional and reassuring they were while doing it. I still go hiking from time to time, although nowadays I travel to much less exciting places and usually with my husband and our 2 kids. But if there's one thing that I've learned, and one thing I always say to my 2 boys, it's stay on the damn trail. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 9 p.m. EST, and there are super fun live streams on Sunday and Wednesday nights. If you got a story, be sure to submit them over at my email, LetsReadSubmissions@gmail.com, and you might even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks for members of the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations located anywhere you listen to podcasts. I also have a true crime channel called Saturn Soul. All links are in the description below. Thanks so much, friends, and remember, cornbread is friend, not food.